Hell on earth. The sum of all our fears. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 flattened entire cities, killed hundreds of thousands of people, injured, displaced, and affected 500,000. Japan surrendered immediately. World War II was over within days. The impact was felt not just across space, but also across time. The question of whether the bombings prevented millions of further casualties by bringing a quick end to the war has long been debated. What is certain, though, is that Hiroshima and Nagasaki left a scar on humanity's psyche. They acted, and still do, as the ultimate deterrent, as a reminder of the destructive power of nuclear weapons. Chapter 2. M.A.D. A few months before Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Allies raced to liberate Europe and defeat the Nazis. World War II was barely over when the Western Allies and the Soviet Union turned against each other in a power struggle that was to dominate the world for the rest of the 20th century. The endgame of the Second World War in Europe played out in Germany. Berlin became the ultimate prize in a tug-of-war, a Cold War that lasted 45 years. The story of Berlin is the story of Europe.
At the end of the war, it had been a bit of a race. Who could get to Berlin first? Whoever tanks made it was consolidating that part of Germany into their sphere of influence. And so faced with this massive threat coming from the Soviet Union, the Western European countries had to bring America into the fold, and the Soviet Union, Stalin and his henchmen, had to realize that if they tried to take any more territory, they would be met with this massive retaliation, that Western Europe and the Americans and the Canadians would not stand for it.
The Allies won the Battle for Berlin. The city was divided into 4 sectors, which reflected the division of Germany into 4 zones of occupation, and ultimately into 2 states, West and East Germany. The division of Germany became the division of Europe, and then the division of the entire world into 2 competing camps with distinct ideological, political, economic, and social systems. 2 diametrically opposed visions about the role of the state and of the individual. The metaphorical Iron Curtain that separated the West from the East eventually became a physical wall that separated families overnight and for life. Berlin became the front line of the Cold War.
Russia, the Soviet Union as it then was trying to seize territory in Europe to bring it into the Soviet Empire. It had already managed to do that with countries that were independent in the interwar years, and I'm thinking of the Baltic states in particular, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Obviously, the Western European countries were apprehensive that the Soviet Union, which was also a giant military power, which had lost 20 million of its own people in the Second World War, could at any stage roll its tanks further into Western Europe.
The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was founded in 1949 as an alliance for the defense of freedom in the West.
It was always said that NATO was founded to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down.
I think generally people realised that this was a good thing, a force for good, a force for freedom, and maintained people's democracy and freedom of speech and generally the ability to go about their lives the way they wanted to go about them, in contrast to what they were seeing in Eastern Europe and the part of Europe that was under the sway of the Soviet Union at that time. People who couldn't travel, who had severe shortages of food, they couldn't study the subjects that they wanted to do, they could not write freely, all those sorts of things, and people were very aware of those difficulties and tensions.
In a continent that had been ravaged by 2 catastrophic wars in the space of 30 years, and that was again facing the spectre of totalitarianism, NATO became the foundation of Europe's security architecture, even before a small group of visionary leaders started to build the treaties and communities that would eventually lead to the creation of the European Union. The cornerstone of NATO's purpose is Article 5 of its charter.
The Article 5 commitment on which NATO was founded is that an attack on one is an attack on all, every member of NATO, regardless of who is attacked.
Therefore, from its inception, deterrence was NATO's reason of existence and main strategy.
Deterrence, in the NATO sense, was focused very much on nuclear retaliation. If Russia dared to launch a nuclear strike, or indeed a territorial land grab on Western Europe, NATO forces, led by the US, the UK and France, would or could retaliate with nuclear capability.
At its core, the Cold War was a psychological war game, projecting confidence and power. Setting clear red lines and sticking to them is the key to being credible.
Deterrence only works if the person who is committing the infringement really believes that the person having that done to them will react. And that was what sustained NATO through the Cold War. The sense, even the Soviet Union leaders, Stalin, Khrushchev and Brezhnev, believed that if they really crossed a line, the West would retaliate.
What followed in the 1950s and 60s was a massive nuclear arms race, with each side acquiring thousands of nuclear warheads that could annihilate entire continents in the space of a few minutes.
Both the Soviet Union and the West had nuclear weapons pointed at each other and, as it were, ready to go. People more or less on a sort of hair trigger along the inner German border, expecting that at any moment they might see somebody coming towards them with hostile intentions.
If you think back to the 1960s, very early 60s, beyond my memory, of the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, when the world seemed on the brink of nuclear war at that time. I think it's very, very difficult to remember and describe these feelings because we've got so used to our comfortable lives.
You know, that was a big existential threat, but it was also in some ways quite unlikely to happen, partly because of the nuclear deterrent, because everybody knew what the consequences would be.
This became known as M.A.D, Mutually Assured Destruction. It was the absolute certainty that any nuclear warfare would be terminal for humanity that prevented political leaders from escalating the Cold War into a hot one. Perhaps ironically, M.A.D became the ultimate deterrent that has prevented war breaking out in Europe over the last 75 years.
It's very important to remind people who didn't grow up during the Cold War that the UK in particular adopted what's called a no first use of nuclear power. They were not going to nuke Moscow or Leningrad because it would have only been in retaliation.
Nuclear powers often pledge that they will not strike first. However, a number of things can disturb that balance of terror. If one side suddenly appears to develop an advantage, anything that could even theoretically enable it to use nuclear weapons without suffering the consequences, then that could be profoundly destabilizing, catastrophic even, as the other side may decide to escalate or even to strike first so as to cancel or preempt that advantage. This is known as the security dilemma, and it is the main reason anti-missile defense shields, such as the so-called Star Wars system in the 1980s, have been so controversial. In addition to escalation, other incidents could lead to nuclear annihilation at any point. Failures of technology, miscommunication, human error.
One has to remember there were still some very tense moments. You know, there were still a lot of opportunities for the two sides to misinterpret each other's movements. And famously, there was a NATO exercise called Able Archer, which, as we learned subsequently, the Soviet Union for a while thought was not just an exercise, but actually the preparation for an attack. And equally, there were occasions on which, on our side, people misinterpreted, for example, radar data, thinking that the Russians might be launching an attack, and that turned out not to be the case. So, you know, in retrospect, you can see that there were some quite dangerous moments.
The 1970s were a decade of de-escalation, with the two superpowers engaging in extensive negotiations, the Strategic Arms Limitations Talks, SALT. The two agreements, SALT I in 1972 and SALT II in 1979, were the promising first steps in a long process of controlling and reducing the manufacture of nuclear weapons. However, the early 1980s saw a period of tensions, not just between the two camps, but also domestically in the West. The Soviet Union's deployment of SS-20 Pioneer intermediate-range ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads in the late 1970s was seen as a direct threat to the security of Western Europe. Each SS-20 missile could be armed with 3 independently controlled nuclear warheads, giving it the destructive power of 11 Hiroshima bombs. It could be transported and prepared for launch in minutes, and could hit targets across Europe. In response, NATO decided to restore the balance of power by deploying Pershing and cruise missiles across the West, while at the same time extending an olive branch to the Soviets, an offer to mutually ban all medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles across Europe. This became known as the double or dual-track decision.
The twin-track decision that led to the deployment of cruise and Pershing missiles was taken in 1979, and it was really politically divisive in the UK and indeed many other countries.
In West Germany, a massive peace movement started to mobilize against the deployment of the missiles. In the UK, CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, favoured unilateral decommissioning of all nuclear weapons. NATO found itself having to balance credible deterrence with arms control negotiations and a divided public opinion domestically.
In all those countries that were taking cruise and Pershing missiles, there were big demonstrations against them. But one has to remember that they were actually the minority. The majority supported NATO, supported the government, supported the decision. But it's, you know, the minority that gets a lot of coverage. And we had to take on that minority. We had to ensure that the counter view was given as to why it was important to deploy cruise and Pershing missiles in Europe, and at the same time negotiate with the Soviet Union to try and negotiate away the numbers of missiles and warheads.
The election by the Soviet Politburo of Mikhail Gorbachev as leader of the Soviet Union in 1985 changed the trajectory of history. Nuclear arms control negotiations resumed. Gorbachev met US President Ronald Reagan at Reykjavik in October 1986. The leaders of the two superpowers signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in Washington in 1987. With the Soviet Union facing severe economic pressure internally and political pressure across Europe, everything was about to change. Within 4 years, the Berlin Wall opened, the Cold War ended, the Warsaw Pact, NATO's archenemy, collapsed, and the Soviet Union dissolved into 15 independent states.
Well, I was in the UK delegation to NATO dealing with conventional arms control at a time when actually the Cold War was coming to an end. And initially we didn't realise that. So I was posted to NATO in the spring of 1987. Gorbachev had been in office as General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union for, I suppose, about 2 years by that point. And things were starting to move, but still arms control negotiations between NATO and the Warsaw Pact had been going on since the mid-1970s without making any real progress. And we were making a new attempt to try to find a slightly different format and a new way of addressing arms control in Europe. But we didn't know whether that was going to succeed or not. So by the time I left NATO 3.5 years later, the picture had changed very dramatically. The Warsaw Pact had disintegrated. We had managed to sign far-reaching arms control treaties, the US-Soviet agreement on intermediate-range nuclear forces, and then agreements between 23 members of NATO and the Warsaw Pact on conventional force reductions in Europe. So you've seen these huge changes taking place in a very short period of time.
An entire security architecture for Europe was put in place at the end of the Cold War. It is that architecture that has kept the continent secure until today.
Today, people feel that they're living in a more sort of, in many respects, their freedom seems to be guaranteed. They're reaping actually the benefits of what NATO has helped to create over the past 70 years. You know, that protection of those freedoms, the ability to speak freely, to do what you want to do within the rule of law, to be able to travel and to travel extensively in Europe. And if it wasn't for what we had done in the past 70-odd years, we might not have reached the stage that we have now.
The West won the Cold War, but NATO suddenly found itself having to justify its continuing existence, a victim of its own success, a defense alliance without an obvious enemy. But the optimism and stability of the early 1990s was not to last very long.